Previously on Murder on Music Row.
You know, wrote the best song I could on any given day and hoped for the best.
So people were trying to get noticed back then, and I'd like to, you know, I can honestly say I've never, ever taken anything of value to put a song on a chart or to improve a song's chart number, ever in the 40 years I've been doing charts.
I mean, there's so many people putting out records, you know, just to be on the charts, you know. I mean, it's thrilling to at least be on the charts, you know.
There's no question that I think that he paid money to have his records put on Cashbox. I know. I mean, there's no question in my mind.
They thought no one would miss it once it was dead and gone. Why, they said no one would buy them old drinking and cheating songs.
Larry Cordell thought Murder on Music Row would be the perfect song for George Jones.
Oh, it's a good story. I'll tell you about that. Nora Wilson, who's a friend of ours, well, he obviously hears Murder on Music Row. I mean, they're playing it every day. He calls me one day and he says, Cord, he says, what do you think about me taking this song to Jones? And I said, Nora, what do you think? I mean, listen to it. It's made for him. So he says, well, I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it to him if it's okay. And I said, absolutely, take it out there. So he takes it to Jones and they turn it down.
Let me say that again. The perfect song for George Jones wasn't perfect enough, I guess. And then that same George Jones eventually, years later, cut a version of Murder on Music Row, a duet with Dierks Bentley. And then he told everybody he always wanted to do it. I can say this, George Jones missed a big opportunity. When former MCA President Tony Brown heard Murder on Music Row on the radio,
and when I first heard it, I just bust out laughing because that's when everybody was bitching about the drums being too loud and all the guitars being arena rock guitar solos and stuff. You know, bluegrassers are elitist. They are, man. You know, I mean, Larry and those guys, they cut that song to make a statement. They meant that.
You know what? That didn't stop Tony Brown from taking the song to another George. Brown represented George Strait. He told me he thought it would be great for Strait and Alan Jackson. He called them the flag bearers for traditional country music.
And it would be so funny to have you guys do this as a lark. And so we cut it. It's like tongue-in-cheek.
Oh, my goodness. That song is not a lark to the guys who made it. George Strait and Alan Jackson were going to do this song. But with every piece of good news, bad news. MCA decided not to release Murder on Music Row as a single. How could that be? This is Murder on Music Row, an investigative podcast. I'm Keith Sharon. I work for the Tennessean in Nashville. On March 9th, 1989, a young man named Kevin Hughes was shot twice in the head in the middle of Music Row. In August of 2022, my editor handed me a flash drive full of police files, interrogation reports, coroner notes, crime scene photos and drawings, phone records, and internal memos between Nashville police, the FBI, and law enforcement officials in other states. Somewhere along the way, I began to feel like it was our responsibility to tell the story that 2 bullets stopped Kevin Hughes from telling. This is episode 5, It Ain't My Fault. I enjoyed meeting and talking with Sammy Sadler. We spent a couple hours together in the Tennessean office. He introduced me to his fiancée, Melody. She's very nice. I came away thinking, he's a good guy, soft-spoken, good sense of humor. He's got a drywall business in Texas. He's still singing in clubs and releasing records. I've read the entire police investigation into his life and the book he wrote. I've seen and heard him interviewed at least a dozen times. Quite often, he and I exchange direct messages over Facebook to the point I feel like I almost know him, or like I knew him in the 1980s. There's a detail from his story I thought he would be uncomfortable talking about, but he wasn't really. In the end of 1988 and the start of 1989, Sammy Sadler was a dog, if you know what I mean. Remember, he was 22 years old and married. This guy had women all over Nashville. At first, he lied to police, saying he was a faithful husband. Detective Bill Pridemore called his father in Texas as if to say, "Get your boy to give it to us straight." After that, Sammy agreed to tell the truth. He talked about having one-night stands with a woman who was a record promoter. She was 39. There was another woman who he met in a supermarket parking lot. There was another woman he met at Shoney's. Her husband was a musician. And then there was a woman named Kathy. The last time I talked to him, he first said he didn't remember Kathy. I pushed him a little about it, and then he answered with a sly smile.
I may have done that. It's just probably somebody that I met and hooked up with. You know, I mean, musicians are, known to stray a little bit, And back in those days, I was probably guilty of doing it just like a lot of them. We probably have done things that we are not proud of and shouldn't have done.
I should have warned you, he uses the royal we a lot. He met Kathy at the country radio seminar, the weekend before Kevin Hughes was shot to death. Pridemore interviewed Kathy on April 3rd, 1989. She said she gave Sammy her phone number and that he called her every single day for a week leading up to the murder, which gets us to the morning of March 9th, 1989. What you're about to hear is a detailed account of that day of the murder, based on phone records, my interviews, and police reports. Sammy Sadler woke up early in his Polo Park apartment in Donaldson. At 7:48 a.m., he called his parents in Texas. Back in the day, you could tell the operator how to bill the call. Sammy charged the call to Evergreen Records, where he had worked since 1985. He said he may have had permission from Evergreen to do this. He didn't remember. At 9:01 a.m., he called his parents again, and again, he charged the call to Evergreen. All his long-distance calls that day are part of the police record. They don't have a record of his local calls. We know he made at least one local call that didn't appear on the records because Kathy remembered. On the morning of March 9th, she said Sammy called her and invited her to meet him at Evergreen Records later that night, and she agreed. He said he would call her again at 4:30 p.m. to finalize a time for her to meet him. That meeting never happened. Sammy said it was supposed to be a normal day at Evergreen that Thursday. Calling radio stations, calling Cashbox magazine, just like always. He told me there was nothing unusual at all about that day. Sometime that morning, Sammy later told police he got a call from Kevin Hughes. Kevin was compiling the new chart for the upcoming issue of Cashbox magazine. Sammy's song, Tell It Like It Is, was sitting at number 46 on the country indie chart when the day began. Sammy's account of the day is in the police file. There are notes from an interview conducted March 17, 1989, when Sammy was still in the hospital 8 days after the murder. Sammy told police that on that morning phone call, Kevin revealed he would be dropping 4 radio stations from his weekly reports. KJKK in Dallas-Fort Worth, WCTY in Montville, Connecticut, WJRD in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and WPAY in Portsmouth, Ohio. Counting those 4, Kevin had dropped 42 stations from Cashbox's weekly list of reporting stations since he had taken over as chart director. Reporting stations gave statistics on airplay so Cashbox could rank songs. Police never pinned down the details as to specifically why those 4 particular were dropped on that particular day. The implication was those 4 were pocket stations for Chuck Dixon, the independent promoter who witnesses said was controlling the Cashbox charts. If Chuck lost those stations, it would be more difficult to manipulate the chart numbers. One result of Kevin's new radio station count would be that Sammy's song would not be on the chart the following week. What did Sammy do with that information? According to his 9:30 a.m. March 17, 1989 interview with Pridemore, This is from a supplemental report. It's in the case file. Pridemore was reporting what Sammy told him at the time. Sammy told police he got in his truck and drove to Chuck Dixon's office. The Dixon Morris office was at 2 Music Circle South, which was and is an office building. Chuck wasn't there. So Sammy wrote out a note informing Chuck about the radio station drops. 33 years later, in his interview with me, Sammy said he didn't remember Kevin's call about the station drops. And he said the drive to Chuck's office didn't happen, even though the notes of both those events are in the police file.
I don't remember him telling me anything about dropping stations or any of that.
So you drive to Chuck's office. Do you remember driving to Chuck's?
I didn't drive to Chuck's office. Not to my knowledge.
It didn't happen.
Not that I know of, no.
Police interviewed Sharon Corbett, who worked in the same office complex and had a desk close to the Dixon Morris desks. I read the notes from Pridemore's interview with Sharon. Pridemore talked to her February 15th, 2002, 13 years after Kevin Hughes was murdered. I have tried, but I couldn't track her down. She told Pridemore Sammy walked into the office very upset. Sharon said Sammy got into it with Chuck's business partner, Craig Morris. And the police file says that you had a heated argument with Craig Morris in the office. And that you wrote Chuck a note saying that Kevin had dropped 4 stations.
I don't remember any of that.
Sammy told me the police reports don't reflect reality.
I don't believe a lot of stuff that, they say. All I know is what I lived, and all I can tell you is what I lived through my eyes.
A police report says Chuck Dixon got Sammy's message about the drop stations on March 9th, 1989, because he began calling repeatedly 2 of Kevin's friends. One of them was Cecilia Walker, who worked at Cashbox. Chuck wanted to know why Kevin was dropping the stations. In his book, A Hit with a Bullet, Sammy described his, quote, completely normal day, unquote, like this.
During the day, I made some business calls, ran some errands, and worked out. That afternoon, I made some more calls and ran more errands.
That's the voice of Tennessean reporter Evan Mealins. He's going to read the parts I referenced from Sammy's book. At 4:55 p.m., Kent Crawford, Kevin's friend from Belmont, called Kevin, and Kevin told him he was going to go to the movies at 5:30, then later, riding around in the car with a friend. Kevin and his friend Sharon Pennington, who worked at the independent label Step One Records, left for the movies a little after 5. I talked to Sharon Pennington, but she respectfully declined my request for a recorded interview. Sharon told police Chuck had called her, asking her to tell Kevin not to drop the stations. Sharon told Kevin Chuck was very upset. Sharon told police Kevin told her he had dropped the stations because they were padding their numbers to manipulate the chart. And that Kevin told her Chuck had called him 3 times already that day. Cecilia Walker, who worked at Cashbox, told Pridemore Chuck Dixon's last phone call to her came at 5:15 p.m. after Kevin and Sharon left the office to go to the movies. Remember, as you're listening to this, they're talking about an independent promoter, Chuck Dixon, who's not supposed to have influence over the music charts, calling Cashbox employees over and over and over on the day the chart was being prepared. After the movie, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Sharon dropped off Kevin at the Cashbox office, 1300 Division Street. Pridemore interviewed Chuck Dixon on March 13th, 1989, 4 days after the murder. In Pridemore's notes from that interview, it says Chuck Dixon talked to Kevin between 7:30 and 8 p.m. on the night Kevin died. Chuck told Pridemore Kevin mentioned dropping the 4 stations. Chuck said he told Kevin to, quote, do what he thought he had to do, unquote. After he hung up, Chuck said Kevin quickly called him back to discuss a new record he had heard. According to Chuck, there was no drama and no tension. Sometime that evening, Sammy says he got into an argument with his wife, Genia. He didn't tell police about that argument when he was being questioned almost 35 years ago. I still wish Genia, who was Sammy's wife at the time, would talk to me about her memories of that night. Sammy called Kevin, he said, looking for an escape. He just wanted to get away from his wife. Sammy made plans to meet Kevin at the Cashbox office. At 7:44 p.m., Sammy made another long-distance call to his parents. This time, the call was charged to his home phone. Kevin's friend, Leslie Levin, called from the Belmont Library asking for a ride. Leslie's interview is part of the police file. Leslie said Kevin told him he couldn't give him a ride because Sammy was coming. Leslie said Kevin told him Sammy was upset. Leslie told Detective Pat Postiglione. Kevin, he said, that's right, the good kid from Belmont had been taking payoffs from promoters. I've got to hop into the narrative here. That's two people, Leslie Levin and Kent Crawford, both close friends of Kevin, who told police Kevin had taken money from promoters. Several things could have been true at the same time. Kevin could have been taking money, he could have felt horrible about it, and he could have been trying to clean up the chart. There was another very significant call that night. While Sammy was driving his truck to the offices of Cashbox magazine, Kevin called his brother Kyle.
My mom and dad were gone that night. I don't know if they were at church or something, but I was at home studying for a physics test. Phone rang, went to my mom and dad's room to get it. We talked for about 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. But he was supposed to come home that weekend. He was ready to come home, but he always asked about me. My basketball, how's school going, what's going on. Then he would talk about himself a little bit as far as going on with him. And he just said that, I got something to talk about. I don't want to talk about the phone. I want to talk about when I get home, and I want you to be part of the conversation. And then, he didn't tell me anything over the phone other than that. And then at the end of the conversation, he told me he loved me, which he never did before. But it just seemed odd because he seemed very nervous. He seemed very not himself almost.
Kyle said they would have talked longer.
The reason we had to hang up is because somebody knocked on the door. And he said, it's Sammy, I got to go. We're going out to eat or something like that. Or we're going somewhere. I do remember that right at the end of the conversation.
We know Sammy had arrived at Cashbox by 8:41 p.m. because he called his parents again, this time from Kevin's desk. That's his fourth call to his parents of the day. It's his second call to his parents in the last hour. There was another person in the room when Sammy showed up at Cashbox that night. His name was Steve Hess, and he worked with Kevin on chart research. Hess later said in a deposition that he was hired for his Cashbox position by Chuck Dixon, who wasn't a Cashbox executive or employee, and he was trained by Tony D'Antonio, who was no longer an employee. This was long after Tony D was fired for using drugs and harassing women in the office. Steve would take calls from reporting radio stations and feed the information to Kevin. I talked to Steve and his wife a couple of times. He recently had a stroke, so he was nervous about being recorded. I think he was very clear.
Sammy dropped by there all the time, which is the only thing about Kevin, and I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but the only thing I thought about Kevin that was not a good idea is when he was chart director, he was best friends with an artist trying to make it. And I'm not saying he did anything dirty at all. He was, I don't think he was the opposite of a dirty person. He was a great person, but I just thought it didn't look good.
Sammy was on that chart 6 times.
Yeah.
For several weeks. He had 6 different songs over like 3 or 4 years that were on that chart. And he was on for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, and including the week before Kevin died.
You know what I mean about perception is everything?
Yes.
I just don't think it looked good for him to be the best friend of somebody that was on the chart trying to work their way up.
It looked like a conflict of interest.
Yes, sir. That's what it looked like to me.
Here's the bottom line. The guy sitting next to Kevin, working on the charts, thought Sammy being in the Cashbox office was inappropriate. About 9 p.m., Sammy and Kevin hopped into Kevin's car and went to Captain D's. Sammy said in his book they ordered sandwiches and talked and laughed for about an hour. Just a normal dinner, he said. Nothing about dropping stations, nothing about Chuck Dixon or a heated argument in Chuck Dixon's office, nothing about Sammy's song exiting the chart. While all this was going on, all these phone calls and Kevin working on the country indie chart, a man with a ski mask and a gun had already decided he was going to kill Kevin Hughes. I'll have much more about the killer's movements in an upcoming episode. Just remember, as Sammy and Kevin sat in the restaurant, the murder of Kevin Hughes had already been in progress for several hours. By all accounts, Sammy and Kevin left Captain D's before 10 p.m. They got back into Kevin's Pontiac Sunbird. We don't know if Sammy's idea to stop at Evergreen Records came to him at the restaurant or in the car or earlier. Sammy wanted to stop to call his parents. Again. So they stopped. Sammy said he made a 10 p.m. call to Texas and introduced his parents to Kevin. Apparently, he hadn't introduced them to Kevin when he had called them earlier from Kevin's desk. It was during what Sammy described as that 10 p.m. phone call that he said he heard a rattling noise. Sammy said Kevin looked out the window and saw a black guy. The police report about the phone call ends this way, quote, "We could not locate a phone call from Evergreen Records or Sammy's home during the time period which Sammy states he called Bonham, Texas," unquote. Sammy said after his phone call to his parents, he and Kevin waited 20 minutes before they walked outside because they were concerned for their safety. He said when he locked the Evergreen door, he felt like a homeowner worried about a burglar. When they sat down in the car, Kevin in the driver's seat, Sammy in the passenger seat, a man in a ski mask stepped, quote, "out of the shadows," end quote. This is the way Sammy described it in his book.
"Look out, he's got a gun," I yelled, my voice sounding like a scared child. I threw up my hands, saw a flash, and fell sideways and flopped on the floorboard.
A few paragraphs later,
I tried to get up, but the seat was slippery and blood was going everywhere.
The story he told police during the investigation contradicts that description. At the time, he told police, he, quote, "laid across the seats," unquote, until the shooting stopped. Sammy's description is for a book written 3 decades after the event they are describing, and his memory may have faded over time. That's understandable. What's hard to understand is how his blood would have got all over the car in the pattern that it did, given his description in the book. The Pontiac Sunbird had a center console separating the driver's and passenger seats. There was no way for a grown man to flop on the floorboard. He would have had to curl up in a ball like a contortionist to fit in the floorboard on the passenger side, or launch himself over the center console and duck his head under the steering wheel to wedge the top half of his body on the driver's side floorboard. Sammy's passenger seat, which was a gray cotton velour, had very little blood compared to the massive amounts of Sammy's blood found on the left side of the driver's seat nearest the driver's door. Remember, Kevin wasn't shot in the car, so this is all Sammy's blood. There's a large amount on the lower right side of the steering wheel where the driver's right hand would be if he was holding the wheel between the 4 and 5 o'clock position. There were pools of blood on the driver's seat where the driver's left knee would normally be. There's no blood on the driver's side floor mat. From the blood pictured in the crime scene photos, the fleshy part of the inside of Sammy's right arm between his elbow and bicep, which was the only part bleeding, slid across the steering wheel, near the spot where you would put your key in the ignition. It was inside his arm, about 4 inches below his armpit where he was shot. It's hard to imagine how blood from that spot got all over the bottom of the steering wheel. His right elbow sat long enough to pool blood on the left edge of the driver's seat. Was Sammy scrambling to get out of the car, away from the shooter, crawling across the driver's seat toward the driver's side door after Kevin fell out of the car? Witnesses said Kevin barrel rolled out of the driver's side. Was Sammy trying to follow behind him? Did he suddenly stop and decide to lie there with his elbow propped on the edge of the driver's seat, blood pooling as he waited while the killer chased Kevin down the street? Why did Kevin roll out of the car? That's always struck me as an interesting detail. The witnesses said he rolled out. Had Sammy flopped across Kevin's legs, causing him to roll instead of quickly stepping out of the car? I searched the coroner's report for any mention of Sammy's blood on Kevin's clothes, but there was no mention of that. Had Kevin dived out of the car trying to stay low? Here's another interesting detail. In Sammy's book, which includes crime scene photos, many with his own blood trailing across the concrete outside Kevin's car, there's a picture of a car in the spot where the shooting took place. The driver's side door is open, but there's no blood on the front seat. Here's the thing. The car in the picture, in Sammy's book, isn't Kevin's car. The steering wheel is different. The back windows are different. The car has a gray side panel that Kevin's car didn't have. It's a police photo of a car clearly labeled Plymouth across the trunk. I came across the same photo in the police files I reviewed. Kevin's car was a Pontiac. Remember from the last episode, I explained there was that other theory that Kevin was shot by mistake. For some unexplained reason, the Metro Nashville Police Department took pictures of a Plymouth Sundance at the scene of the crime. Kevin's car wasn't a Plymouth, and even David Sheeran's rental car, the one from the alternative theory that never went anywhere, was a Dodge Shadow. Still, That police picture of a Plymouth Sundance with no blood is the one Sammy used in his book. One more note. Kevin's keys were found next to his body. He had carried them away from the car. Did Sammy get shot in the seconds after Kevin sat down and before Kevin could put his keys in the ignition? Or did he take them out of the ignition after the shooting started? I always wondered why he would hang on to his keys while he was running for his life. When you look back on a crime, like I'm doing, you have the advantage of hindsight. I get that. I guess it's up to the interpretation of you, the person listening to this podcast, how much weight to give what I'm about to tell you. On 16th Avenue South, when Sammy left the car that night, dripping blood, he hustled away from the spot Kevin had fallen, up 2 flights of stairs. He talked to his parents on the phone and his wife. He didn't call police. As Sammy hid under a desk upstairs, a dozen or so people ran toward Kevin Hughes on the street to try to help. Who knows how any of us would react with a bullet in our arm. One night in November of 2023, I drove sound editor Amanda Rossman on the same route Sammy Sadler and Kevin Hughes took on the night of the murder. I've never been to this spot before, so I'm going to be seeing it for the first time just like you. Awesome. We started on Division Street in front of the offices where Cashbox Magazine used to be. If Sammy's correct and the killer had to be following them from this point forward of the night, because the decisions that they started to make after this, Sammy said, were random. So who knew that they were going to stop here or there?
Or who knew he would even be with Sammy to start with? Like, why would they think that he would even want to leave?
Right.
So why wouldn't they have tried to do something here? Like, how did they even know he was going... Unless they've been waiting here for him the whole time to exit the building, and then they see him leave.
Right. But again, this is kind of, I mean, look around. It's an out-of-the-way place. Can't be a lot of lights here at night. If you're going to shoot somebody, wouldn't this be a better place than the middle of Music Row?
Because everything around here right now is new. Like, these are newer establishments, like hotels and different things around here, apartments and...
In 1989, this must have been a very dark place.
Yeah.
But it's just confusing to me. If I'm a guy with a ski mask and a gun, what's wrong with this spot? We drove through the traffic circle with the Musica statue, right on 17, left on West End. We went to where Captain D's used to be. So as they parked here, they may have had a killer on their tail and didn't realize it, but again... You're in a parking lot that's kind of off the main street. It's 2 miles from Cashbox to this spot.
Which feels further because it's actually, there's a lot of lights and intersections.
If you're going to get shot and somebody's following you with a ski mask and a gun, why not do it here?
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't do it here. So then we headed toward Music Row. We parked in exactly the same spot where Kevin parked on the night of the murder. So what do you think of the Murder on Music Row site now that you've seen it in the flesh?
I wasn't expecting it to be this busy. Granted, it's a little bit earlier than the time of the murder, but it just doesn't make sense to me. Out of all the places, why there?
So what's interesting to me about sitting here is that imagine you're standing on the Evergreen porch and you are concerned about safety because they quote unquote heard the rattling of the front door when they were inside making a phone call. And Sammy said he felt like a homeowner who thought there was a burglar outside.
Mm-hmm.
So they waited inside. They peeked out the windows to see if anybody was there. No one was there. They came out on the porch and looked both ways to see that the coast was clear to get back to this spot where we're sitting right now. And while that was going on, there was a gunman 47 feet away, according to the police, in between the two buildings. All right, you want to get out and walk it?
this. As soon as you reach for the door, I'll start.
Okay. Keith is getting into position. I'm coming around the side of the car like I am Sammy. I'm going to walk over normal speed. I'm now reaching for the handle, trying to get in. I go to get in, and there's no way that he could have made it in time. You're not fast enough.
There's no way. There's no way I could get
right
into jam that door.
Right.
Here's my question. What if the cops had it wrong and the killer wasn't between the buildings? What if the killer was hiding behind the passenger side back tire of Kevin's car? Do you have any theories about where he came from?
I don't. I mean, because we didn't see anything when we were walking out. I just walked in front of his car and opened the door and sat down, and then boom, he's right there.
In front of the car?
I walked in front of Kevin's car.
What if he was hiding behind?
I don't know. Again, I can't tell you that. All I know is whenever I sat down, started to reach for the door, I caught something moving out of the corner of my eye, and I looked up, and boom, he was right there.
Had to be the rear of the car.
I don't know.
The police have a diagram. The closest structure was 40 feet away. Did you guys sit and talk with the doors of the car open? You could touch him.
Yeah, I mean, he was right on top of me.
Officer David Williams was sitting in his patrol car outside Berry Hill Liquors on 8th Avenue South. He figured if he sat there, he could deter crime at and around the liquor store.
On this particular night, March 9th, I was in the parking lot of the liquor store there on 8th Avenue South, just riding it out till it's time to go home. And that's when they put the shooting call out.
He was the first officer on the scene.
When I came up on the scene, of course, it was a lot of people out. I pulled right up by the car that Sammy and Kevin were occupying at the time of the shooting. I remember one girl saying, "There's another guy shot."
Williams followed the trail of blood from Kevin's car to the third-floor apartment of Philip Barnhart and Connie Gaddis. They had called down to Sammy when he was bleeding in the car and offered help. Sammy asked Connie to call his parents in Texas. He told them he had been shot. It was his 6th call to them that day. I sent a message to Sammy about setting up an interview with his father. His fiancée, Melody, sent me a note back saying Jerry Sadler was on oxygen and was having trouble hearing. She said he would not be available for an interview. When Sammy finished telling his parents he was shot, he was able to dial the next call himself. He said that call was to his wife. That was the last phone call Sammy made that day. Williams had followed Sammy's blood trail up the stairs. He thought he was going into an office, but it was Philip and Connie's apartment building.
But as I got close, people were coming out of the office building screaming, "He's up here, he's up here." I went up the steps, and that's where I found Sammy. Sammy was obviously in shock. You could tell he was just terrified.
Connie was applying direct pressure to the wound. Williams called for an ambulance and turned to leave.
I felt comfortable enough that she was there rendering aid to Sammy that I told him, I said, "I've got to go out there and check on your friend. I'll be back." He was adamant that I did not leave him.
Williams went back downstairs to the crime scene.
There were a lot of people out there. That's when I looked across 16th Avenue and seen Chris Gustafson and Willie Nelson standing there. They never came across over to where the incident was.
One note about Officer Williams and Sammy Sadler. 30 years after the shooting, they became friends. They're still close today. Among the crowd at the murder scene, the police file mentions 2 friends of Sammy Sadler, Tony Nail and Craig Morris. Morris was the business partner of Chuck Dixon. The police report said Nail, quote, entered the crime scene claiming to be a relative, end quote. It doesn't say who he was a relative of. The report says this happened at 10:45 p.m. That's about 15 minutes after the shooting. Tony Nail was not Sammy's or Kevin's relative. James Anthony Tony Nail was 41 years old in 1989. In his younger days, he had been a baseball star, a 6'2", 185-pound outfielder. He had played for a brief moment of minor league ball with the St. Louis Cardinals in 1969, the Gulf Coast League. In 7 games, he went to the plate 18 times with 3 walks, a sacrifice fly, and 1 hit. His batting average was .071. He had 1 stolen base and 1 RBI. I've tried to find him. Like Sammy said, he was a friend of Evergreen owner Johnny Morris, who is now dead. Tony Nail used to be a youth coach at a baseball academy in Williamson County, but he no longer works there, and his trail went cold. Craig Morris was Chuck Dixon's business partner, another independent music promoter. I tried for a year to interview Craig Morris. I found a Craig Morris on Facebook, but it was the wrong Craig Morris. I went to the home of a person named Craig Morris and left a note with my phone number, but he never called me. I also have a friend who knows Craig, but she couldn't convince him to talk with me. So those two guys, Nail and Morris, were at the crime scene, with Nail trying to get inside the police tape. Sammy was transported to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. In his retelling of the story, Sammy often goes into detail about what it was like at the hospital. He said he was told that he was admitted under a fake name with an armed guard at his door. I asked him what name he used. He couldn't remember. At 11:30 p.m., Detective L. Carter interviewed Sammy in his hospital bed. I'm sorry I don't have Carter's first name. Carter's report says while he was talking with Sammy, they were surprised when 2 visitors walked into the room. Any guesses? Tony Nail and Craig Morris. If he was under a fake name with an armed guard, how did they find him and get in?
Tony Nail, I remember Tony.
Tell me about Tony.
I just met him through Johnny.
Why would he show up at the crime scene saying he was your relative?
I have no idea.
Craig Morris told Detective Carter in the hospital room he didn't know anybody who would want to shoot Sammy or Kevin. The police file has a note that when Morris left Sammy's hospital room, he stopped at a payphone and called Chuck Dixon. It was about 3 a.m., March 10th, 1989, when the phone rang in Carmi, Illinois. Larry Hughes took the call with the horrible information from the Nashville police. Then he walked down the hall to his youngest son's bedroom. He needed to tell Kyle about his big brother.
My dad came and told me what had happened. I think about 3 or 4 in the morning, probably. Of course, it was just a horrible situation.
Did he know any details?
His Nashville police had called and said he had been, shot. As we start getting the more of the details later on. That night is kind of a blur. I just remember coming to my room, waking me up. We didn't have many details until a couple days later, what was going on or what really happened.
Kyle remembers that it was he who was given the task of cleaning out the place where he had spent the previous summer with his big brother.
I remember going to his apartment and getting everything. His contact case was out. The bottle was there. He didn't even put the little lids back on the contact case. So, he left in a hurry or what?
I went over every one of the details from the night of the murder with Bill Pridemore and Kyle Hughes. Sammy informing Chuck Dixon that Kevin was dropping stations, Sammy coming over for a visit when a murder plot was taking place, Sammy choosing to stop at Evergreen, the long-distance call that couldn't be found, Sammy's song dropping off the Cashbox chart, the killer lying in wait a few feet from Sammy without Sammy seeing him, Sammy's description of a slender black guy when every other witness said a chubby white guy.
Well, I think I may have confronted him about that. I should have if I didn't. There adds suspicion to, how can he be so wrong and all these other people seem, even ones driving down the street in a car. Was he just trying to throw us off?
He remembers what his thoughts were at the time. How could somebody get from the brick wall in between the door and Sammy that fast?
Good question. There's why I thought Sammy may have something to do with it. He was shot. But he wasn't killed. For a long time, I thought he set it all up because he's the one that called and asked Kevin, let's go eat. Let's drive over to Evergreen Records, under the pretense that they had a toll-free phone, call the family without costing them anything.
The big detail Pridemore kept coming back to, if the trip to Evergreen to make the phone call was random, how did the killer know where to hide?
You think he's just sitting there waiting, hoping that Kevin's there? Why does Kevin need to be there? There's no reason for him to be there. I could see Sammy being there, but not Kevin. What's the odds that somebody knew that he was going to be there. You know, the chances of somebody sitting there and waiting all night with a gun and a ski mask and a hat, waiting for them to hopefully show up.
Sammy said he remembers when Pridemore confronted him in 1989.
And, you know, they made a statement like, well, you know, we got somebody said you're supposed to get Kevin down here and get him shot and killed. And just immediately inside of me, just when I get angry, it's like I get hot. You know, I get like, feel like a rush of heat come through me. And I remember feeling that. And I looked at them and I said, man, y'all are crazy. You know, y'all are just, you're crazy. I said, that's just nuts. Why am I going to get shot myself and do this? I mean, it just, the way that they were doing and acting and saying that stuff, it just made me mad.
Kyle Hughes was surprised by facts he had never heard. I laid those facts out to him in August of 2023 at his dining room table in Florida. He was surrounded by memorabilia he had saved, elementary school photos of Kevin, letters Kevin had written, lots of Cashbox magazines. The conversation turned to how honest Kevin Hughes was, and how it's very on brand, as they say today, that he would try to clean up the country music charts. When I finished, I asked Kyle about Sammy Sadler.
Lying to somebody. He might lie to everybody. What do you think? That he's in cahoots with Chuck. I mean, he knows that he's got to tell Chuck. Chuck's his boss. And that's what I get out of it, that there's something that they both have to lose by him doing that, by Kevin doing that.
Sammy's theory of the case is that the killer was stalking Kevin at the Cashbox office. But he didn't shoot him there. He followed them to Captain D's, but he didn't shoot him there, and followed them to Evergreen Records, where he hid in the dark, waiting for them to come back to Kevin's car.
If somebody was after Kevin, they could have been there to do something to him at Cashbox or something, and I show up out of the blue and interrupt whatever they're going to do. I mean, I have no idea, and they could have followed us from the time that we left there and followed us to wherever we went. That's the only thing that I know.
Sammy said the police made him feel guilty.
I'm not a suspect. I didn't have anything to do with any of this. I'm an innocent bystander getting shot. My friend gets killed. It's not right.
You're critical of the police in this.
Very critical. I'm telling it like it is. I don't like what they did. I don't like how they treated me. They put me through hell, put my family through hell, and I don't appreciate it.
Sammy said the police turned Kevin's family against him. To this day, Kevin's family has never spoken to Sammy. Sammy blamed police for that.
You know, the police wouldn't let me talk to Kevin's family. They wouldn't let my family talk to them. They didn't tell us anything. My parents called for 2 or 3 years trying to ask the police what was going on, what was happening. They wouldn't tell us anything.
Sammy gets emotional when he talks about Kevin's family.
I just want them to know how sorry I am for all the things that happened to him and their family. I know what it's done to me and my family. I can't imagine, you know, what they're going through and what they've gone through. It's devastating. I know what it's done to me. Changed my life. Changed my family's life. It bothers me today if the police have made them think that I was involved in something, because that's a lie. I don't appreciate the way he treated me.
Sammy wants the police to admit they were wrong about him.
I still think they owe me an apology. I still think they've done it wrong. I still think they handled it wrong. I still think that they put me and my family through stuff that we shouldn't have had to go through and been scrutinized like that.
Kyle Hughes said the police had nothing to do with his or his family's opinion of Sammy Sadler.
What's always gone through my mind was that other people were involved in this situation. It wasn't a chance encounter. It was set up. You know, I've always questioned a lot of things that happened, of course. You know, we always knew something else was there. We always knew one person was responsible for this thing. There's multiple people involved in it. But this seems very leading to me. There was at least one other person involved.
Did anybody turn Kevin Hughes' family against Sammy?
Absolutely not. No, nobody turned us against anyone. You know, my mom and dad are forgiving, and I don't know what to say, but I always knew in my heart there was something else going on.
Remember one of the details of how Sammy's day started? He had met a girl, Kathy. He was supposed to call her back at 4:30 to tell her when to meet him in Evergreen later that night. He never made that call, which seems unusual since he'd been so intent on talking to her every day of the week. At 10:30 p.m., the time the murder was taking place, Kathy and her friend were on their way to Evergreen Records. She later told police she still wanted to meet Sammy. When she got there, the place was surrounded by police, so she didn't stop. She didn't know what happened until she heard the news the next day. For several days after, she tried to reach Sammy Sadler. He never responded. It sounded like she kind of liked him. In Sammy's book about the shooting, he never mentioned Kathy. His book also talks about how being a suspect in the murder on Music Row, in effect, ruined his career. You might be surprised what I found when I looked at what happened to his career after the shooting, but then again, you might not. Next time on Murder on Music Row.
Well, I mean, my career was basically over. You know, again, I feel like how the police have treated me and how they've done me. It put a cloud over me, put a cloud over my head, my career, and to me, it's just not fair.
Tony developed some rare blood disease and had to go to Mexico to get the treatments that weren't available in the United States right after Kevin was killed.
Very like mafia kind of guy, always rolled around in limos, you know, wore a lot of gold, was real flashy, like wore these expensive suits.
They get these poor innocent kids coming in town, like I told you, and they take all their money and then send them on their way, and not a tear is shed. So I don't like any of them.
Murder on Music Row was reported, written, and narrated by me, Keith Sharon. The executive producers were Gannett's Vice President of Local News and Tennessean editor Michael Anastasi, and Tennessean News Director Ben Goad. The project editor was Dwayne Gang. The sound editor was Amanda Rossman. Our reporting on the legacy of the Murder on Music Row doesn't end with this podcast. If you've been duped by an unscrupulous promoter in Nashville, we want to hear your story. Please send an email to ksharon@tennessean.com. That's the letter K, SHARON @tennessean.com. Include some details of what happened to you and how you can be reached. Thanks for listening.